Good evening, everyone. We'll get the evening's proceedings underway. It's my great pleasure to issue a very warm welcome here to the New School. My name is Tim Marshall. I'm the Provost of the New School. And I would like to extend also a very special welcome to all of those who are joining us via live stream. And I encourage the online audience to participate in tonight's discussion by submitting your questions in the chat window of your screen. So to our audience in the room and to those online, thank you for all choosing to spend your evening with us as we host the final lecture in the 2015 Public Policy in Action Lecture Series for the semester, in which we have featured over 22 participants. I invite everyone to participate in our ongoing conversation on social media by using the hashtag #PolicyForJustice, hashtag #PolicyForJustice. The New School's mission is to prepare students to understand, contribute to, and succeed in a rapidly changing society, and thus make the world a better and more just place. This is a university that strives to foster creativity, innovation, and a desire to challenge the status quo, both through what and how we teach and through the intellectual ambitions of the school itself. The New School uses social engagement to orientate students' academic experience to help them become critically engaged citizens dedicated to solving problems and contributing to the public good. The Milano School of International Affairs, Management and Urban Policy is proud to take an active role in achieving these goals by engaging with some of the distinguished leaders in public policy, advocacy, and academia in our age. The 2015 Henry Cohen Lecture Series, Public Policy in Action, is devoted to advancing social equity in America. This series is an extension of a new course introduced this semester at the New School. Both the course, titled Public Policy in Action, Advancing Social Equity in America, and the lecture series examine how public policy can serve as a vehicle to advance economic and social inclusion in the context of evolving demographic, economic, and political shifts in America. Public Policy in Action serves as a catalyst for the continuing dialogue on the state of social justice in America. The lecture series has explored topics including framing civil rights for the 21st century, changing demographics and the economic imperative, race, higher education, and social justice, measuring and influencing public opinion, and the new civil rights agenda. Throughout the semester, the 2015 Henry Cohen Lecture Series has received national attention and has created a permanent platform at the New School to bring together practitioners, academics, staff and students. I'm happy to report that both the class and lectures have been so well received that this will be a standard part of our curriculum here going forward. So it's a very successful thing. And I want to commend the hard work, dedication, and vision shared by Milano's Dean, Michelle DePass, who you'll hear from in a moment, Juliet Ellis, and Derek Hamilton, all of whom have been central in developing the lecture series and teaching the class. I'd also like to extend a tremendous thank you to Susan Halpern, the New School trustee and donor who made this series possible. Thank you, Susan. And it is now my tremendous pleasure to introduce Michelle DePass, Dean of Milano, who will introduce tonight's distinguished guests. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. It's my pleasure tonight, and also with some sadness because this is our last Henry Cohen lecture for the semester, to welcome you all. And really thank you for being here for the culmination of our 2015 Henry Cohen Lecture Series. And thank you again. I have to give my, I have to underscore a thank you to Susan Halpern, who is not only a donor, but who has become a friend and a real supporter in what we do. So thank you, Susan. So this semester, in light of the incidents of fatal police brutality in Ferguson, on Staten Island, and in many, many other places, too many other places in this country, Milano has become a place and space for this very important discussion about race, equity in the United States. We've had over 22 participants contribute to the dialogue in the Henry Cohen Lecture Series through the Public Policy in Action Lecture Series, and we've hosted over 1,000 audience members here on campus and nearly 1,300 more online via live stream. They've helped us, you've all helped us continue this conversation on social media using our hashtag #PolicyForJustice. Although tonight's lecture marks the end of this series, it does not mark the end of the conversation. Here at Milano and the New School, we're going to continue to keep the dialogue open and to continue to work with you all, the next generation of policymakers. It's my honor to introduce tonight's speakers who will help us bring this series to a close this semester with a discussion of the new civil rights agenda. It's about power. And just to quote one of our speakers tonight, who said earlier, sometimes we have to get more formal about things that have gotten informal. And we have to have a real discussion about power and where civil rights is going. And that's what we're going to do tonight. So tonight's faculty discussant will be Professor Jeff Smith. Jeff is the Assistant Professor of Politics and Advocacy. Jeff teaches and researches politics and political campaigns, policy advocacy, and the legislative process. He served in the Missouri Senate from 2006 to 2009, representing inner city St. Louis, where he co-founded a group of charter schools called the Confluence Academies. Trading Places, his PhD thesis on U.S. partisan realignment from 1975 to 2004 was recently published as a book, and he's currently completing a book manuscript about the politics of prison reform. In addition to writing for political science journals, he is an advice columnist for New York political publication City and State, and frequently addresses audiences of public officials on ethics and politics. His youth-powered grassroots congressional campaign was chronicled in the film, Can Mr. Smith Get to Washington Anymore?, which was shortlisted for an Academy Award. Thank you for being a participant, Jeff. Our panel will be moderated by Juliet Ellis and myself. Juliet is Assistant General Manager for External Affairs at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, where she oversees the government and legislative affairs, communication, sustainability planning, and community benefits. A mouthful. Prior to joining the SFPUC, Ellis spent 9 years as Executive Director of Urban Habitat, a regional social and environmental justice organization. Urban Habitat works in partnership with low-income communities and communities of color to advance social, economic, and environmental justice in the Bay Area. Before her role at Urban Habitat, Juliet was the Associate Program Officer for the Neighborhood and Community Development Office at the San Francisco Foundation. And finally, it's my privilege to introduce our speakers for this evening, Ben Jealous and Phaedra Ellis-Lamkins. Ben Jealous is a partner at the Kapor Center. He's the former president and CEO of the NAACP. He stepped down from this post at the end of 2013. The youngest president in its history, he began his career at 18, opening mail at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Jealous has been a leader of successful state and local movements to ban the death penalty, outlaw racial profiling, defend voting rights, secure marriage equality, and free multiple wrongly incarcerated people. Under his leadership, the NAACP grew to be the largest civil rights organization online and on mobile, experienced its first multi-year membership growth in 20 years, and became the largest community-based, nonpartisan voter registration operation in the country. A builder of robust coalitions, Jealous's leadership at the NAACP included bringing environmental organizations into the fight to protect voting rights, and convincing well-known conservatives to join the NAACP in challenging mass incarceration. Prior to the NAACP, he spent 15 years serving as a journalist and community organizer, while at Mississippi's Jackson Advocate newspaper. His investigations were credited with exposing corruption at a state penitentiary and proving the innocence of a black farmer who was being framed for arson. A Rhodes Scholar, he has been named to the 40 under 40 lists of both Forbes and Times Magazine, and he is #1 on the Roots.com 2013 list of black leaders under 45. Phaedra Ellis-Lamkins currently serves as a board member at Green for All. Before becoming a board member, Phaedra served as the chief executive officer. Under her leadership, Green for All became one of the country's leading advocates for clean energy economy, and one of its most important voices on the intersection of economics and environment. Phaedra led Green for All to several groundbreaking policy victories and innovative pilot projects at the federal, state, and local levels, while redefining the face of environmentalism through youth engagement and partnerships with popular artists. Prior to joining Green for All, Phaedra was a leader in California's labor movement, heading both the South Bay AFL-CIO Labor Council and Working Partnership USA. This is giving her a unique perspective that has enabled her to bring labor, environmental, business, grassroots, and government leaders together in a common purpose. The scope and scale of Phaedra's many achievements have won her wide praise and recognition, being featured in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, the Huffington Post, ABC, BET, CNN, all the important alphabet soup. And Phaedra serves as the chair of the Department of Labor's Advisory Committee on Apprenticeship. And in 2010, Phaedra was named a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. As you can see, we have incredible, distinguished leaders to talk to you tonight and provide tonight's Henry Cohen Lecture. So without further ado, I want to call Bandele to the podium. Thank you. Enjoy this evening.
Well, good evening. It is good to be back in the city. I must say, though, tonight my heart and my prayers are really back in Baltimore, which is my family's home, and it's where I work every day, and it's a great city in our country that's in a hard place right now, not dissimilar from Ferguson and so many other places. And I would just ask that we all keep Baltimore in our thoughts. Tonight, I want to talk to you about movements, about power, about where we are as a country. As I talked about to the students before this, we are at a decision point, ultimately. Those of us who are part of what we call the movement, this is a decision point for the movement. But more importantly, all of us who are part of this country, we're at a decision point for our country, and our communities exist somewhere in between those two things, and they have decisions to make as well, and I'll get to all of that, I hope, either in my comments or the question and answer. But right now, I want to take you back to where my head has been all day, which was this city a little over 20 years ago when the Rodney King decision came down, and the weeks after. A couple of days later, I was at a friend's 21st birthday party. It was started off as a great night. You know, a round of toasts went up. The first was to my friend for turning 21. The second, though, before the guy could get his arm all the way up and kind of in the faux black nationalist spirit of, you know, the Tribe Called Quest days that were the early 1990s, a friend started pouring libations to heartfelt, to all of our friends who had been shot and killed or sent to prison before we even got to college. And then, trying to turn the mood around, a friend threw up a toast to the fact that one more of us had survived to 21. Threw up a toast to the fact that one more of us had survived to 21, that one more young black man, one more young man of color, in this, the world's wealthiest democracy, had simply breathed past his 21st birthday. I couldn't raise my glass on that last one. The notion cut me like a knife. The fact that somebody thought that it was an achievement for us just to breathe past our 21st birthday kept me up and kept me reeling with memories of friends who had been shot and killed and whose lives had been derailed by gangs in California and in Baltimore. And so I finally did what I'm still blessed to be able to do. You know, I took my burden and put it right down on my grandmother's table. My grandma turns 99 in November. She is sharp as a tack. She cleans up at bridge, because really, who thinks that the 98-year-old still has it all together? And at the time, she was in her mid to late 70s, and she blessed us because she's the griot of our family. She carries with her roughly 200 years of black history told and experienced firsthand. The 100 or so she inherited from her grandparents who had been born slaves, and now the almost 100 she has witnessed herself. And I went right to my grandmother's table and I said, "What happened, Grandma? You said that we were the children of the dream, that we were the first in our family who wouldn't have to sow, we just had to reap. That all the big victories had been won, that you all and my mother's generation had killed Jim Crow, just like your parents and their parents' generation had killed his daddy. And that all we had to do was reap. Reap what you guys had sown with your tears and your feet and your blood and your voices. And all we had to do, in other words, was just walk a straight line and keep our noses clean. Study hard and the rest would take care of itself." And I said, "Grandma, that's worked for me. It's worked for many of us. I dare say that it has not worked for most of us, because my generation, this generation, the first generation in a history of black people in this country to be told fighting is optional. Well, we've come of age just in time to find ourselves the most incarcerated people on the planet and the most murdered in the country. So please, Grandma, tell me what happened." And she got real quiet. And she said, "Well, grandson, it's sad, but it's simple. We got what we fought for, but we lost what we had. We got what we fought for, but we lost what we had. We got the right to be a police officer. We lost the right to live in a safe community. We got the right to send our kids to any school in town. We lost the right to assume that they would be welcomed and loved and cared for the way that she was in that one-room schoolhouse she went to in Petersburg, Virginia, or my mom was at the segregated schoolhouse she went to just down the street from the housing projects in West Baltimore, where our family started our journey. Got the right to buy a house in any neighborhood, lost land by the thousands, the millions of acres, 500 to 1,000 acres per day from the start of World War II till the end of the Cold War, to be exact. And in that simple admonition, there was a pretty clear warning that, grandson, it's not enough to know at any moment in history what we're fighting for. You also have to have stock of what we have. Right? Or you may find yourself fighting to re-elect a black man as president and find at the same time they're taking away your neighbor's voting rights. But in her eyes, in the shadow that passed across her face, was a real biting condemnation that she didn't think that my generation really understood either. We didn't know what we were fighting for. We didn't know what they had won for us. And even worse, we didn't know how to fight. And I decided that night, as I was riding the New Jersey Transit bus back from Exit 0 on the Garden State Parkway in Cape May, where she had retired in West Cape May, an old black vacation community, to Harlem ultimately via Port Authority, that if I did anything, I would figure out what I was fighting for and how to fight. And in my family, the conversation about how to fight really starts with the Reconstruction Statesman. Because even though my mom started her life in the housing projects, we were raised, if you will, with the knowledge that my grandmother's grandfather had been born a slave, died a state senator, co-founded Virginia State University, ran a large farm. And my grandfather's great-grandfather had been born a slave, died having co-signed the Virginia Constitution right after the Civil War, the so-called Reconstruction Constitution, having been one of the first black members of the House of Delegates, and having co-founded a bank. And what those men teach you with their example, the same way that Frederick Douglass, if you reflect on his biography, right, is abolitionist and U.S. Marshal and leader of the Freedmen's Bank. What they teach you by their example is that everything you do should be for the same purpose. There was no distinction. There was no, oh, I'm going to make money at the bank exploiting my community, and then in my charity work, I will try to repair some of the damage I've done. No, everything was with the same purpose. You ran the bank to empower your community. You founded the college to empower your community. You advocated to empower your community. You represented to empower your community, and ultimately to empower our country. What those men, those Reconstruction statesmen understood was ultimately that power in this country comes down to two variables: organized people and organized money. And that you are more powerful if you can combine the two. When you see a young person who's like headed in and they say, oh, well, you know, I'm going to go get rich, you know, working on Wall Street, and so that I can, you know, help my family, and that will really be my objective. There's some honor in that, but typically they find ultimately it's self-defeating. Because we all exist in this country, you know, ultimately, in a context of power that includes the economy, that includes our democracy, that includes your personal agency. But typically, if you aren't invested in building our democracy, you will, you know, and accessing power that way, you'll find that your power in the economy suffers, and vice versa. For me, this in some ways became relevant when I was stepping down as president of the NAACP, and I'll close on a more personal note to kind of lead towards my part of the conversation after Phaedra comes up. I had sort of run my course. You know, I started out in the mailroom, as Dean mentioned, when I was 18, and been an organizer and a journalist. But ultimately, when you're in an industry, for lack of a better word, and the movement is that in many ways, and you start off at the bottom and you end up at the top, what you do next typically is go teach. And I was like 41 years old, and still had a lot of fight in me. And a friend came to me and he said, you know, Ben, I'd like you to be a partner at my investment firm. And I said, well, geez, you know, I've been avoiding being a partner at an investment firm like my entire career. You know, I started off at Columbia University. I was a Rhodes Scholar. That opportunities were always there. I always said no. Why is this different? And then in a very single-minded way, he said, because we only invest in companies that we believe will make the world better for working people. And our mechanism for scaling them is the marketplace. And then I remembered my grandmother's grandfather, and especially my grandfather's great-grandfather, and that they understood that too, that in this country, that is to its core a capitalist country, if you really want to transform the society, there's really few things more powerful than the economy. The government rivals that, but at this moment in Washington, where we've taken do-nothingism to a whole new low, right? The Do-Nothing Congress, they were called such, I think they were roughly 1948, 49, because they passed less than 1,000 bills. The Congress I was dealing with when I left, the Congress of 2012, 2013, passed, 2011, 2012 rather, 2011, 2012, passed less than 230 bills. 10% of them were for commemorative coins and the renaming of post offices. The Washington Post did a profile based on the most pitiful congressman in town. He was the one that could neither get his post office bill nor his coin bill passed. What excites me about being here tonight, and where I hope we'll go with this conversation, is the rising generation of people who are leaders in this city. This city will play a transformative role in this century. We will see more and more people moving into the cities, and New York really, I think, is the one that is worthy of greatest hope. I was most proud in my time at NAACP, many ways for the fights that we waged here and the way in which we connected them to building power. And none more than the battle here to end stop and frisk, and to kind of end my comments where we started about policing issues. There was a moment, I haven't talked about this publicly before, but there was a moment when when George Gresham, the head of 1199, and Reverend Sharpton and myself were in Selma. We were fixing to march from Selma to Montgomery on behalf of immigrants who were fighting a battle down there over their dignity and their access and their ability to keep their families together and frankly, needed allies. And I came to Reverend Sharpton and to George Gresham, who runs the biggest union in the city, and I said, we need to have a Father's Day march against stop and frisk. And they said, why? I said, because there's a bunch of really incredible community organizing groups out there who could use us to frankly make them a little bit more visible and connect them to the mechanisms of power in this country a little bit more directly. And Reverend Sharpton, his genius, leaned back and said, Ben, that's perfect. He said, all of our friends are fixing to run for mayor, and it's going to be hard to figure out who we back. Christine Quinn, Bill Thompson, Bill de Blasio, Lou. He said, so why don't we let the issue pick who we back? The one who will be most against racial profiling. We'll back that one. And so we held this march, and all of them felt, the season was starting, all of them felt obligated to march with us. And then Christine Quinn got Bloomberg's money and support, and she went against us and called the march. She marched in an overreaction. Bill Thompson, whose father had been an NAACP regional director and had almost beaten Bloomberg the cycle before, was the strongest candidate in the black community, with deep roots, got the NYPD endorsement, and did the same thing and said he would keep Ray Kelly as Quinn had. Bill de Blasio, who was raising a black boy in this city, stayed with us the entire way. No one expected him to win. But when you look at the 2% difference between the votes he got and the votes that Bill Thompson got, it's hard to explain that without taking into the fact that Bill Thompson, who's a friend, had decided ultimately to go against the interest of his own community in favor of supporting the interests of the NYPD. My hope for each of you who are in power in the midst of your careers in this city, right? You're building power in your own way, is that you approach your work the way that the Reconstruction statesmen did. That everything you do, you let that be your medium for advancing the interests of your community and ultimately our country in becoming what Frederick Douglass described, frankly, as the destiny and the purpose of our movement, which is to make this country the most perfect example of the unity and dignity of the human family that the world has ever seen. If we can make that happen here in New York, we can make it true for our country as a whole. Thank you and God bless.
Good evening. I was in the labor movement, so it's always hard for me to not be at a podium and start to chant. I know, I feel like I should be saying, "Si se puede, ¿qué quieres?" But I won't, because I haven't been in the labor movement for a bit, and I've probably lost my ability to do chants effectively. So it's really my pleasure to be here, and it's mostly my pleasure to be here because I love Michelle DePass, who is the dean here, and I would do anything that she or Juliet asked me to do. So if they ask you if I did good, what are you going to say? Great. So like, how good did she do? Michelle, I'm done. But in all seriousness, it's always interesting to hear your bio read because it's like all the things that someone wrote about you that you don't care about, which is truly how I don't remember those things. Just so you know, I've spent the last 2 years working for Prince, which what I've learned is that counts way more than anything else about electing people. People want to talk to you about that. And it's also a far bigger fight for incredible justice that we can talk about. And so I spent 13 years of my life working in the labor movement, mostly figuring out how did you use the power of the labor movement to make a bigger social change. Because what we understood fundamentally, that is, if people thought the labor movement acted for them, they were more likely to be supportive of the labor movement. And what we believed is that if the labor movement didn't stand for things like living wages, community benefits agreements, health care for kids, that we wouldn't be a labor movement that was capable of making change. Also, what we understood is, who do you think the people most likely to join unions are? Guess. Poor people, true. Mostly women, mostly single moms who are Latinas. And so what we found is that also we had to have an agenda that spoke to members that were younger, browner, and more willing to take champion change. So I did that for a long time, and then I went, and I heard you guys had Van come speak here. And so then I worked at an organization that Van had founded called Green for All. And I learned a lot. And then I had a baby, which changes everything in your life. And it mostly changed my perspective about the world. And all of a sudden I wanted to measure the way my life was in terms of, was I home? Was I a good parent? And so I decided to take some time, and I spent the last 2 years working with Prince and NPG Music Publishing, and really doing two things that were very important, I think. The first, making sure that he had his masters back, which was important. He'd been a long fight, I think, on behalf of all musicians, in terms of, do people have the right to own the things that they create? And the second, then figuring out what to do with his catalog. And I can only tell you that he is among the most amazing human beings, and there is no human that I've met that is a better political philosopher in terms of change and what the world should look like than him. And now I'm working in tech, thanks to Ben. And what I can tell you about that is that capital really matters. And I know we're talking about power today, and I want to tell you some of the things that I've learned. The first I learned in the labor movement, which is that the ability to win elections matters more than anything else to elected officials. Right? When you have this very glamorous, beautiful thing you think you happen and care about politics, and you think, my ideas matter, my vision matters, and then what you discover is whether you can guarantee that person wins an election matters more than anything else. And so we spent a lot of time figuring out, how do we make sure that people could win elections? The second thing I learned about in the labor movement was the value of morality, which always gets undervalued, which is, for us, it was people of faith and clergy, which is the ability to actually do things because they were right from a public mattered. And so for us, whether we were having a fight for janitors in terms of a moral fight of people being able to support themselves, if we had fights for kids to be able to have health insurance, it was really about morality that mattered. The thing I learned in the music business is that no one turns down a meeting for Prince, even though they do the president. And I say that, you say that kind of funny, but the truth is, it's really true. If I said to you right now, you think if this room was filled up and Prince were performing, do you think people would come? Yeah. And the reason is because people will enjoy themselves. They'll feel connected to something. They'll feel committed. And the thing that I think I never valued enough is that people actually want to feel good about what they're doing, and they want to feel joyous. And what music and culture have the ability to do in terms of change and power is to connect people to something emotionally that continues to bring them joy instead of pain. Have any of you ever been to a meeting or volunteered for something? Yes, right? And in my experience, it's not usually a joyous experience, right? It's like you come to the meeting and first people kind of look at you and go, I don't know if you're down enough, if you're cool enough, if you're in the right group. And then you sit down and it's long and painful. They don't feed you. They might give you bad punch and cookies. And then at the end of the day, you go, what did I just do? And the thing that I've learned is when people come to a concert and they hear amazing music, they're incredibly open to a message. And the thing that I observed is, who do you all think is amazing at change? Who have you thought about it? Have you guys ever been to an evangelical church? This is what happens. It says parking up front for visitors, right? So when you first come, you're like, I'm so special. There's parking right up front for me. Then you come into the meeting and they say, all the visitors stand up and be welcomed. And you stand up and they go, brilliant. We're just so happy to have you here. Then they thank you and they give you cookies. And so I would say that it's like, what gets better than great parking, people clapping for you and giving you cookies at the end, right? And so the thing that I learned most about power is that people want to feel special, they want to feel connected to something, and they want to feel like something moved them and it was joyous, because you're more likely to talk about something enjoyable and joyous than you are something painful. And so as I think about the new civil rights agenda and also what needs to happen, I've become far more committed to groups like the stuff that's happening with Black Lives Matter. And the reason is two things. One, the organizing that's happening there is happening by amazing young women of color who are absolutely using technology in a way that we've never seen before. What they're recognizing is you can make change by connecting to someone through a computer, through a phone, and then turning that into action, and it feels like that's the piece that's been missing. The second thing I learned is when Prince said Black Lives Matter like albums do, it was in Us magazine and it was covered on Entertainment Tonight. And so part of what I've become fully committed to, and as I've seen my history and kind of what I've thought about what change will look like, is if we were to look at Black Lives Matter, you would look at an amazing moment where a woman coined the phrase Black Lives Matter. From there, it was organized onto Twitter. From there, you saw incredible offline organizing. You see an artist of, I don't know that we can even describe Prince's, who he is, but you see him say something on the Grammys that Twitter goes crazy. People magazine goes crazy. And so part of what I've learned is that it is not just one thing. And what you think when you're young and when you're in one movement is you're convinced that your part of the world is the only part that matters, right? When you're in the labor movement, you're like, no one understands but me how important it is. When you're organizing with communities of color, no one is as authentic as me. When you're in music, I can't take that leap, I can't take that change. And so the thing that I've become more committed to than anything is that power cannot happen without all parts, right? That fundamentally, it's only cyclical and momentary if you do just one thing, right? If you're just one part of a movement. But when you look at the most amazing things and the most amazing changes, that it's really when all of those things happened. And I want to say to you that, you know, I've become a parent, as I said, and we were talking about earlier in the class is that there is a very physical feeling of poverty, right? I grew up young in San Francisco and then moved to a suburban community, and I knew I was poor, and I knew people didn't think that was good, right? I knew I should be ashamed. I was talking about we'd been in a grocery store and I'd gone in and my mom had sent me running in, and if any of you, I don't know New York, but in food stamps in California were these green little like fake dollar coupons. And I was in the line paying for the stuff, and this woman started looking at what was in my cart, and she started talking to the shopping clerk about what I was buying and what was appropriate. And I think, you know, at the time I was probably 9, and it took away my dignity in that moment. It made me feel like something must be wrong with my mom or my family, that why didn't, like, clearly we didn't have a right to buy certain things, we didn't know certain things, and it was a very physical feeling. And what happened is my mom got a job, she went back to school, and I knew all of a sudden we were better and that people thought differently about us. And the thing that I have become more committed to than ever as a parent is that the kind of power we want can't allow kids to be treated that way, right? We can't, we have to be the kind of society that says you shouldn't have shame because you don't have as much as the person next to you. And if we can do that with joy and purpose and thoughtfulness, we will be the kind of society that Ben talked to. And I think the reason that Ben and I are so happy to be here when we're taking a 6 a.m. flight back tomorrow to Silicon Valley is because our hope is that the time that we spend with you will help what you're doing. It's our hope and belief that if you are all successful as you already are, that anything we know, anything that we can provide, it's our deepest desire that we not repeat the same mistakes that we've made, and we learn, and that the civil rights agenda, we're talking about old guard versus new guard, and if we are still having that conversations in 20 years, we will have fundamentally lost the last 20 years. If the best conversation we can have is which among us is the most worthy of winning, then we really will be in trouble. And so we really welcome and appreciate this conversation. And our hope is when my daughter comes back in 20 years that you say, it was so great to see your mom, but we just think her thinking was so archaic because we've come so far. And so it really is my joy and pleasure to be here. And I think we really just want to give our deep, deep appreciation for allowing us to be with you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm so honored to be here tonight. I'm a little disappointed that the remarks I just jotted on my BlackBerry I somehow canceled on the way up to the stage, but that's okay. It really is amazing to be here with people like Ben and Phaedra. I'm truly honored and privileged to be responding to their brilliant remarks. I'll start by just sharing that I have a grandma that is eerily like Ben's grandma. When I first ran for Congress, she was 96 at that point, and she had a bridge game, and she was on her 4th bridge game because she'd outlived the first 3 bridge games. And I remember one of her, I was sort of a long shot. I ran in a race against the son of a governor. His father was a 2-term governor, and his mom was a U.S. senator. And my dad was a golf coach. And so, but one of her bridge partners came to her during a bridge game and said, "I got a letter from your grandson. Apparently he's running for Congress, and I'd like to send him a check. You know, can you tell me where to send the money?" And my grandma, 96 years old, replied, "If I were you, I'd save your money." So sounds like they had something in common. But your ancestry, I mean, it's fascinating to hear, about just going from a slave to a senator. I mean, those stories are so amazing and humbling. The Reconstruction statesmen, I think back to someone like George Henry White, who was the final black Reconstruction statesman, the final member of Congress after North Carolina. Southern states began very quickly at the end of Reconstruction enacting Jim Crow statutes to ensure that black people can't vote. The final state to do so in 1898 is North Carolina. And their last black congressman, George Henry White, gave a farewell speech to the U.S. Congress, and he said, "The Negro in power in Congress, we may be leaving this institution today, but mark my words, we will rise phoenix-like from the ashes, and we will be back here in power." And it took 28 years from then for this country to elect another black congressman, but it happened, and there are about 40 today. But it was just hearing about your ancestry was amazing. As I said, my dad was born to a professional athlete and then got cut from his high school basketball team. So seeing the upward mobility in your life is amazing. But I know how you feel when you talked about your heart being in Baltimore tonight, because there were many times during the fall semester when my heart was in St. Louis. The first night of the unrest in St. Louis, I was watching on my television at about 2 in the morning, and of course I couldn't take my eyes off what was happening, because that was home, and many of the people were people that I represented, and I couldn't take my eyes off it. And then I was infuriated, of course, over subsequent days when, instead of focusing on what had happened to this young unarmed man, people were totally focused. Everyone I talked to was focused on, well, why are they looting, and why are they rioting, and yet people I talked to on the ground were telling me that, there were 20 or 30 people doing that, but there were thousands of people marching. And it made me reflect on power and the power of the media to shape perception about what happens in this country. And then I realized that I had contributed to that, because I wouldn't stay up till 3 in the morning to watch a candlelight vigil, but I was contributing my eyeballs and giving viewers to CNN and MSNBC who were covering the unrest. But it saddened me greatly to know that law enforcement, not just during those weeks, but still today, and this will be happening for months in Baltimore, is focused. Law enforcement still today is focused on looking at surveillance tape to figure out who threw a brick in a window last August in St. Louis. What about the thousands of black people who were lynched in the last century in this country? there hasn't been a lot of justice for their descendants. And so I went back to St. Louis, and I spent much of the last 8 months there, and I wrote a short ebook on the historical context, because our news and the people who have power to shape perception in this country, I think, are so sadly ahistorical so often. And so I appreciate the historical context that you brought tonight, Ben. Phaedra, you talked about organized people and organized power, and you talked about parenting and the things that being a parent has taught you. And I really also wanted to speak to that from my own experience. My son, a blonde-haired and blue-eyed 3-year-old boy, is of course obsessed with the police and wanted to be a policeman for Halloween last year. And every time there's a police car, he jumps out of his seat and wants to go see it and wants to go talk to the officers. And when we see people pulled over, my wife, her first reaction is always to say, "Oh, look at the man, the policeman is helping someone." And because my son looks like he does, we can say that with a straight face. And we can say that and not worry about the disappointment and disillusionment that he may well feel someday, like so many other kids in this country, unfortunately, are going to feel when they learn that maybe the policeman isn't just there to help them when they're in a jam. And so I think we learn a tremendous amount from our children. You also talked about the only two things that politicians listen to, and organized people and organized money. You guys both spoke about that. And I wanted to just close by offering a few brief lessons from my time in politics about power and what I learned. The first lesson I learned the day that I got to the Senate in Missouri. And I got on the Senate floor, and I asked a guy who's now our Attorney General, probably going to be our next governor, who was then a colleague of mine named Chris Koster. And I asked him if he had any advice for me. He said, "I only have one piece of advice if you want to succeed in this place. Find somebody bigger than you and go punch him in the mouth." And it sounds glib, but I think there's a lot to it. Because in many respects, having power is being fearless. There's a tremendous amount of power invested in those who people are afraid of, and people are afraid of you when you're not afraid. Second lesson I learned was the same lesson that you talked about, Phaedra. Cookies, and the power of cookies. The most powerful interest group in the state of Missouri was not the billionaire who's been trying to get rid of our state income tax and has spent about $30 million over the last couple of years trying to get rid of our state income tax. He got further away from his goal every year. The most powerful people, I learned one day when I inadvertently got on the Senate floor and spoke to another senator that was filibustering a bill. He wanted to ensure that there would be no legalized midwifery in Missouri. And he inquired of me, and I made the mistake of actually accepting the inquiry and speaking for 15 minutes. And when I got back to my office, I had 75 emails from constituents in my inbox from midwives in my district. The next day, there were about 30 of them in my office with homemade cookies, okay, to tell me, "Senator, you stand up here and you believe in freedom for whether or not a woman should have or not have her child. How can you not believe in our freedom about the way we want to have our children?" And they didn't have a dollar. They didn't spend a dollar on lobbying, but they ended up becoming the most powerful grassroots activists in Missouri politics. And their homemade cookies, every other lobbyist was trying to woo and court you with surf and turf, but that gets old after a while. Homemade cookies, there's something to that. Then the final brief story that I'll tell is about another lesson I learned relating to power, and I think it speaks, again, to what both of you said. You guys have both gone from organizing and activism and journalism and now into the business world. And you have seen, by empathizing and putting yourselves in the shoes of other folks, just how much power how much of an impact money can have. And I think it's an important lesson to be able to put yourselves in the shoes of people to whom you were once vigorously and vehemently opposed. One of the bill that I'm probably most proud of that I was able to sponsor and pass in Missouri was a bill to create an alternative sentence, fathering courts, in Missouri for men who struggled to pay their child support. And when I first suggested it to one of my Republican colleagues, he said that it had no chance of passing because there were 26 Republicans and 8 Democrats in the Senate. And the Senate was overwhelmingly rural and conservative. And he said, "You really think we're going to do something for inner city deadbeat dads?" But he was a friend of mine. And he said, "Look, I see what you're doing, and it probably will help a lot of people, but you need to rethink the whole way you present this bill." And so I came back to his committee the next week, and I opened up my committee hearing by saying, "I want to tell you all today something you'll never hear me say again as long as we serve in the Senate, and that is the fact that Dan Quayle was probably right." You remember Dan Quayle? Who obnoxiously got up and condemned a sitcom mom for having a baby out of wedlock? I said, but there's been a lot of social science in the last 20 years, and it does indeed suggest that 2 parents in a home probably end up resulting in better outcomes for a child. And you and I probably disagree about what the gender of those parents should be, or have to be. But really, there was a lot to that, and this bill today is about figuring out a way to reconnect men in the lives of their children. And instead of sending them to prison if they struggle to pay child support, essentially debtor's prison, let's figure out a way to get them vocational training or substance abuse counseling, whatever they need to get back on their feet and not have a felony conviction, because God knows they can't pay child support from prison. And so I said, today I want to introduce to you a bill that is about 2 things. It's about family values, and it's about being fiscally conservative. Those are 2 things that when I campaigned, I never would have dreamed I would have said. And yet the bill ended up passing the Senate unanimously and ultimately going to the governor's desk and hopefully changing some lives. But it was only, I think, happened because I was able to humble myself, at least temporarily while I was in the Senate, and remind myself that it wasn't about me saying what I wanted to say necessarily. It was about understanding how people in power think and trying to figure out how to put myself in their shoes. So in any case, incredibly valuable lessons from both of you tonight, and I look forward to sharing and hearing more during the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's funny, I got a text from somebody, and they were just like, it looks like there's good turnout because they're streaming live. So for the folks that are streaming live, hello. And I had said, I'm in the front row, and I can't see. So it's good to see all the faces here. So I just want to thank the panelists because the speakers tonight have been just really so on point as we think about wrapping up this series. And we have probably about 15 minutes of this before we open up to Q&A. So I'm going to pose, and I end up never going off the script when after you hear what folks have to say and what happened in the classroom before. So this will be like that. So the questions I gave folks are not the ones that we're going to necessarily use. So one kind of common thread, and I had a chance to talk to Jeff earlier today, and we talked about building power and the fact that for many of us, we have said in conversation together and had those thoughts ourselves about, how effective is the left once we get in power? And I think that many of us up here have a critique about we actually don't know how to govern. We actually don't know what to do when we actually have power. And when I mentioned that train of thought earlier to Jeff today, he's like, I totally agree. And so one question would be that question. I would love to hear folks kind of respond to what's missing and what have we, as far as the left, where have we failed with regards to what to do once we're in power and once we're governing?
Okay, so I love this question, and I'm probably going to think about it differently than everyone else. So, and Juliet would say this is my, I definitely was a street ball, not an NBA player. And there's, she said I'm a prison ball player, thanks.
I'd be the judge of that.
Right. Punch first, yes, hard with a bat. But There are two things that I think that you have to, there's three things I think that are important that we don't do that we have to do for governing. One is stay loyal, because I think the left is notoriously gets freaked out when people get in trouble, when they say something wrong. There's like this big run to like prove you're not with that person and that they're awful, which is like, I am incredibly respect the Republican Party in that people can like get caught with a young prostitute and they're like, really good values, really good values. And they're just like, still a good voter, needs prayer. And we're like, oh my gosh, they voted and didn't say reverend in the right place or something ridiculous. So one is, I just think we don't stick to our teams. And we don't say like, when people are for us, we have to always be for them. And no one is perfect, and people make mistakes. And I see this like when people attack Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton or other folks, and they're like, oh, they're imperfect, as though we're perfect. It's just like, they're for us, be quiet, sit down, and agree with them, right? And I think that's one thing we don't do when we govern is like, I'm for you. So one is we don't stay loyal. The second thing that we don't do is the way that you get attacked 100% of the time when you're on the left is integrity and ethics. And it's always coming for you in finances. And part of what's hard about our folks is we don't come from money and no one trained us appropriately. And so people are making mistakes. And so the second thing is we don't train people for power, and they didn't grow up in power, so they're not ready for it. So the second thing is I would like train people to actually be ready for power. And the third is to have ideas, not just movements. Is I think sometimes, like I so appreciate your example because I think about the number of times we would have an issue and I would say to a legislator, this is what we need to do, and they'd say, that's a violation of my principles. And we'd say, okay, you are gonna lose this fight, and you care about men who you want to be part of their families, and you're gonna have a moral victory in the office while the people impacted are still in the position they were in. And so I think the ability to actually recognize that what we do impacts humans, and it's not about our own moral victory and ego, it's about how do their lives get better or not, I think is really, really important. So those are the things I think that are probably most important for me.
Jeff, I'm going to jump in before I go to Ben.
We saw an example of your first statement. I mean, you here in New York City, you know, Anthony Weiner, he did yeoman's work. Obviously, he loves having his face out there, but I like Anthony. He actually
Such a big door, but just go on.
But he texted, okay? He texted someone who he never met, who was of age, and conversely, as you allude to, David Vitter, a U.S. senator, married, caught with a prostitute, and Republicans circle the wagons, and yet Nancy Pelosi is immediately going to him saying, you gotta resign, you know, for this sort of non-crime. And I think it's endemic to the progressive movement that we tend to do that. With respect to your last point about standing on principle, I think liberals need to do a better job of understanding that like winning and getting 85% of what you want to position to show strength and a victory so you can come back next year and get another 5% and then the final 10% 2 years later should not be, you know, we are very quick, as you note, to say that someone is impure. And I think that, you know, it makes life difficult often for progressive elected officials when we do that. So no one is ever, you know, going to be with you. It's rare that you'll find someone who is with you 100% of the time. And I think we need to do a better job of saying, hey, and we're starting to do this on criminal justice reform, of saying, hey, Rick Perry has closed down a lot of prisons in Texas and is shortening sentences. Well, God bless him. You know, because I disagree with him on every other thing, but he wants limited government, and so do we in this realm, and let's work with him on that. And we're starting to see signs of, I think, a mature movement on that issue.
So I come to this from a bit of a different perspective, which is a perspective of building movements. And I think our biggest mistake as progressives, and especially well-educated ones, is that we forget how it is that we came into this movement, how most people come into this movement. You know, the doorway to a great movement is typically a terrible case. The NAACP, when it was at its infancy and it was growing rapidly, there was the Scottsboro Boys. There was every single lynching that occurred wherever it occurred. There was individual case after individual case, and we grew rapidly. And then we hit a certain point of power and maturity and perspective, and we decided that really needed to be about wholesale change. If you weren't changing the world in that instant for potentially thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds or millions of people, it just wasn't worth doing. And what happened? Our movement began to shrink, and our power began to shrink with it. And we ultimately became less effective at passing legislation. So when I was at the NAACP, the first thing I did is I said, we will be about individual cases again. How does that work? It works with Troy Davis case, I think probably most directly. We were able to, after that case, abolish the death penalty in Connecticut, despite a very high-profile murder trial that was going on of a socialite, the type of thing that would usually just kill debate. We abolished the death penalty. Then we did it in Maryland, the first state ever below the Mason-Dixon to abolish the death penalty. Despite all sorts of threats from the powers that be that killed it every single time. And why was that? Well, if you go and you look at Gallup's polls of that time period, you'll find that the support for the death penalty had fallen to its lowest level since the year it was abolished, albeit temporarily, in 1972. And when you ask Gallup why, they'll say, among other things, because the hashtag #TooMuchDoubt, created by the NAACP and Amnesty, was the second most tweeted about thing in the world in the year prior. That regular folks had tweeted that the hashtag millions of times, and in that moment decided that if they were against what happened to Troy, well, they had to be against the death penalty too. Now, the thing that goes with that, right, is that you have to decide who it is that you're actually leading. And it can't just be your organization as organized at that moment. The Trayvon Martin case, the NAACP's back was really against the wall. We were in Orlando, Florida. When you asked the FBI what city was most likely to burn if the decision came down the wrong way, they would tell you it was Orlando, Florida. You said, when was that likely to happen? They would mention the weekend that our convention was in full swing in Orlando, Florida. And so we sat down, and I sat down with my team, and I said, well, what is the best thing that we can do to help preclude a riot in Orlando? Because if this city burns during our convention, we will be dealing with that probably for a century. I had spent personally more than 3 weeks of my life at that point in Sanford doing all the work knitting together Power in Sanford, so we were very confident that Sanford would be fine. And they said, well, Ben, they said, probably the most powerful tool we have is our email list, because we have about 600,000 people in the country, and we know approximately 20,000 of them are in the Orlando area. If we can get word to them right away, maybe we can shift conversations. And so we prepared 3 emails. One was fine. It was right off the bat. It was basically if George Zimmerman was convicted. The other one was okay. It was, if it was kind of partially convicted, partially acquitted. The third one we ended up redoing and making shorter and shorter and angrier and angrier. It was if he was acquitted of everything. Because that one we knew people would get it on their smartphone, and if we were lucky, they would look at it. And if they looked at it and we didn't meet them exactly where they were in the first line, they would just say, F the NAACP, and delete the email. And they wouldn't get to the part we needed them to get to, which was why there was hope. And so it got shorter and shorter and angrier and angrier. And then there was a very quick transition to, but there's hope, all by itself. And we went into the options for federal civil rights charges, federal criminal charges, and then we went to the action, which was to sign here so we could send a petition that would ultimately have about 2 million people on it to the DOJ. We get out there, we get ready to send out our email. Within minutes, we are subjected to what MoveOn.org, who is carrying our petition as well, would describe as the most significant denial of service attack by hackers that they'd ever seen on an activist website. Usually those attacks, which make it impossible to click through, if you will, you keep clicking and you can't get through, last for hours, 2-3 hours. Ours lasted for 24 hours. And so we said, well, we can't do anything on email, let's push it out on the text platform. Well, it was short, so it was able to go out on text. When that email went out, we had 600,000 people on our email list. Despite the fact that they shut us down for 24 hours, a week later, we had 1.4 million. When that text went out, we had 30,000 people, rather. We had 30,000 people on our text list. We had built it up over the 5 preceding years from 5,000 to 30,000. A week later, we had 423,000 people on our text list. It was the largest activist text list outside of the Obama campaign itself. It was because we were willing to fight for people like all of us, and it was because we were willing to ultimately talk to all of us as people. Our movements are the bedrock of our power on the left. We don't typically have much organized money. There are some billionaires that are friendly to a point. But what we have is masses of people, and that's what this century will be about, is demographics change, and as quite frankly, the widening class divide in this country pushes more and more poor whites towards coming to the conclusion that they have to vote their kitchen table interests along with black folks and Latinos and just get over it in places, frankly, mostly below the Mason-Dixon, but also in the suburbs and, frankly, on Staten Island as well. At the end of the day, it's really less, if you will, our book sense that makes us powerful as progressive leaders. It's our common sense. And when we use it, we can use it to transformative effect.
So we're going to open it up to Q&A, but I'm going to actually have Phaedra, as we wait for folks to come to the mic. You and I had talked literally this morning about Manuel and others that have come and talked about the fact that the demographics in the United States are changing. So this group has heard that. Ben just referred to that, and you kind of made the statement as we were talking offline. The question of, will it make a difference for us as we think about building power? So do you want to segue as we get people queued up?
Yeah, the conversation that I had with Juliet was just, people are so excited about the demographic shift, but if the pattern stays the same, it's not exciting for about 40 years. So, because what we know is that people who vote tend to be older, and so the idea that the population is becoming increasingly a majority of formerly minorities is great, but if people continue the same patterns, there's actually going to be a difficult kind of next 10 to 15 years where people who do vote freak out and realize that demographics are shifting, become more conservative, and the folks who now are the majority, if the voting patterns don't change, it really should be exciting in 40 years. So the question is, how does that shift become a shift of activism instead of the consistent pattern of where we're at right now, where it means more folks of color who become less important, more marginalized, because as the folks that were formerly baby boomers start to vote more, it actually creates a greater challenge for folks. And so that was our conversation. And I said, don't get excited yet, sister.
Yes, thank you. First, I'd like to thank my class. I'm Professor Mawid from NYU. I have the class from Diversity, Racism, Oppression, and Privilege. So give them a hand for coming out.
Fantastic.
The way I asked them to come was that all persons in the class would have to say yes. Everyone had a veto power. The whole class decided to come, so I'm only here because of them. And that is to say, it can't always be about one person, one vote, particularly if you're the so-called minority in terms of numbers. You alluded to the fact that we had a Kairos moment in New York City. I'd like you to say, what options do we have? Is it a question of human rights, bringing the human rights agenda, such that we have a charter that's based upon the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or is it some other kind of mechanism that brings this conversation to today and what's in front of us right now? Thank you. Yusef Clyde said the antisocial contract. So I'd like to say, what's the new contract that we have to build today? Thank you.
Look, I think there's a real value to human rights principles. I used to run the U.S. Domestic Human Rights Program for Amnesty, and I believe in bringing human rights home. With that said, I think we really have to go back to the kind of genius of Paulo Freire, who was very, very clear that you don't have to be an expert to free yourself. And so there's a real trip that can happen around kind of human rights jargon. It quickly becomes kind of an expert's game. And we really have to frankly, focus more on organizing and allowing people to see the power that they have within themselves and the genius that they have within themselves to both define what the obstacles are for them and to overcome them, right? Not just as individuals, but as a community. And so ultimately, I think more of the solution ultimately, lies in the strategies that people like Fannie Lou Hamer, like Ms. Baker, in actually citizen schools, not seeing voter registration as something that we do once every 2 or 4 years, but part of a process and an ongoing conversation that we're going to seek to ultimately have with every citizen in our community, everybody who can vote in our community. These are things like the new Georgia project's doing right now, where they registered the biggest voter registration drive Georgia's seen in 40 years last year. What are they doing this year besides fighting the Secretary of State, trying to, frankly, to make sure that they couldn't process all of those voter registrations? They're going back to every single person that they registered and talking to them about their power and their potential as citizens and how they actually wield that power. So I think it's actually, frankly, more basic. Now, in that context, it becomes more possible to actually achieve things like social rights and some of the goals of our human rights documents, but it starts with that real basic step of just empowering everyday people.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Phaedra and the gentleman to the right for recognizing the value of children and families. After all, children are our future, and the highest or the optimal survivor of any child is growing up whenever possible with his or her natural biological family. And I hope that the new paradigm on the left for civil rights gets away from the oxymoronic, politically correct left who has dedicated most of his energy to attack the natural family. That's my point. We need to base on science, and nature knows the best. And every time we go against nature, we pay a very, very, very heavy price. The second thing is that we have the means these days, because of technology and because of the internet and communications, to have a really, I will call, participatory democracy. I do believe sincerely that this system that we have of representative democracy is a joke, because most of the dirty politicians could be easily bought, and we know that certain groups of power have enough money to buy probably 99% of the dirty politicians. So when de Blasio was elected, before he took power, we had here a tent in Manhattan where, because of technology, every subject could be discussed and put to the vote. I think that in the future, we need to move to participatory democracy, like has been implemented in some places in Brazil, like in Porto Alegre, where the city of Porto Alegre has a participatory budget. Otherwise, it's extremely hard to trust these politicians. They can easily be bought. They promise something.
Give us a moment to comment on your question. Thank you.
I was going to see if you had a question.
Can that be implemented?
Yeah, I mean, I think New York City is a great laboratory for that. Right now, we're seeing the councilman in Park Slope area of Brooklyn, like Brad Lander. He's actually from my hometown, and so I know what he's doing a little bit. And one of our former students at the New School in the Milano program, James Sabudi, was at the city council, developed the participatory budgeting process that many councilmen, led by Brad Lander, are using throughout the city. And so hopefully this can be a model for the rest of the country, as we are in another area you addressed, which is the public financing of campaigns. The clean money campaign reform in New York City, by which a public grant gives a 6-to-1 match for low dollar contributions, ought to be a model for something we should do in federal elections around the country.
There's something so beautiful about being in the private sector.
and that you really don't care anymore. And I just, it's just the most beautiful part of the world. And with that, I just want to say that, you know, I actually wasn't saying that. I was saying something fundamentally different. And what I was saying is that I think that children should be valued, which means wherever they get love, whatever it looks like, whoever supports them. So I was just saying something quite the opposite. And so, while I always appreciate someone being nice to you, the great part of my life is I just want to be clear, and I also want to be down about who I am. And so I think that I was saying the opposite, in that people shouldn't be judged based on who they love or where they get it, that it's really about how do we make sure that all kids get to feel valued regardless of where they come from, who supported them. And so I think that whether it is chosen or born, that really kids should be valued, and that should kind of be where the sentence and the period ends, is they deserve to be valued.
Good evening. Walter Scott in North Charleston, South Carolina, was shot in the back fleeing from a policeman. He was afraid he'd be arrested for child support arrears. There's a connection with this to the 14th Amendment, which was one of the great Reconstruction amendments. We would all agree that policemen should be held accountable, that prosecutors who withhold exculpatory evidence should be held accountable. I'm going to put forth the proposition that judges should be held accountable. They are the only group of citizens who have immunity, and that came about with one of the worst decisions of the Supreme Court in the 20th century. Do we all know what a tubal ligation is? A 15-year-old girl went into a courtroom. The judge told her, go to the hospital to get your appendix removed. He secretly told the surgeon to do a tubal ligation, cutting off her fallopian tubes. The girl did not have notice of the operation. She thought her appendix was going to be removed. She did not have an attorney as a minor. She was 15 years old, and she did not have a chance to appeal this decision. When she found out she was permanently sterilized when she married, she tried to sue the judge, and in a narrow 5-3 decision, the Supreme Court of the United States affirmed the reprehensible doctrine of judicial immunity.
Sir, your question?
Yes. Why is there total silence about this reprehensible doctrine where Thurgood Marshall, Potter Stewart, and Justice Lewis declared in dissent, a judge is not free like a loose cannon to inflict indiscriminate damage whenever he declares he is acting in a judicial capacity. There should be lectures on this at the New School, at NYU, at Columbia University. This is one of the worst decisions of the Supreme Court.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I want to take the next question as well so that we can get a critical mass.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I am the director of a large family homeless shelter in Brownsville, Brooklyn. We have 450 children under 18. Last year in 2014, according to Coalition for the Homeless, 1 in 17 black children in New York City experienced the New York City shelter system. And my real question, and only 1 in 361 white children. And my question is, how are we going to engage? How can I engage my families that I see every day in the new civil rights agenda? Because that's what has to happen.
Look, when I became president of the NAACP, I said to our staff that we had a problem, which is a recession was starting. And when we looked at the economic programs that we had, we really didn't have an affirmative program unless you owned a home, you were a corporate mid-level manager or above, or you owned a Harley. Because our only public accommodations case was over Black Bike Week. We had our diversity report cards, and we had a whole campaign around foreclosures. And that from that point forward, any program that we created would be at the nexus of both the most urgent civil rights issues of the day, of course, we're going to pay attention, but also the sort of ongoing and sort of much weakened in many ways campaign to end poverty in our country. That if it didn't help move the dime on poverty, I wasn't interested, frankly, going to raise money to go do it. And the reason for that is, again, in the context of the black community, the black upper middle class has quadrupled since Dr. King died. The percentage of blacks in poverty hasn't gone down 1 percentage point. And so there's a real need for us to be intentional as a community and ultimately as a country for finishing the work that Dr. King was killed seeking to prosecute, which was the war on poverty, for which he was prepared, his Poor People's Campaign, he was actually planning on civil disobedience so stark and aggressive in Washington, D.C., that he anticipated being in prison for 5 years as a result, to show you where his heart was. If I was in your shoes, I would, frankly, work with donors, unions, others who are willing to write 501c4 checks, to hire 501c4 organizers to just work with your population and ultimately their family members and churches and the people who support and care about them. The reality is, as Jeff said, politicians only care about organized money and organized people. The strength, as Saul Alinsky kind of reminded all of us, oftentimes the poorest people have a lot of power that they squander. Right? And so I would really encourage you to really spend a lot of energy, first yourself, and ultimately getting them to invest, getting others to invest in the power that's right there that's being squandered. Of families to really speak from a position of great moral authority about their aspirations, the obstacles others are putting in the way, and the need for us as a city to, frankly, get behind them. Because that's, and the last thing I'll say is this. When you look at what it's going to take for our country to succeed, how we treat the poor is critical. Singapore beats us basically every year. They typically come in first in K through 12 preparation of their children. We come in now like down in the 30s, right? We used to be first. We're now down in the 30s. When you dig into it, their rich kids do as well as our rich kids. But the disparity between how their poor kids perform and how their rich kids perform is 4 times less. If we want to really rapidly advance as a country, the population that you represent and work with and those sort of 1 and 2 degrees away, it's critical that we as a country actually have an agenda for lifting them up. We won't have that until that population has an agenda for itself.
And the only thing I would add is being from San Francisco, where the conversation is happening so similar around housing and economics and jobs. I mean, San Francisco, the lack of affordable housing for very low-income people, homeless folks, et cetera. I mean, it's at this level of shrillness within the city, whether it's the mayor now talking about it or beyond the base groups. And so I think that these are the issues that are going to transform New York, that's going to transform San Francisco, that's going to transform Oakland into places that I think that it's even moving beyond natural constituencies of folks just saying, this is just not okay. These communities are changing in ways that will never be able to get San Francisco, New York, et cetera, back. And so trying to figure out how to make those connections, because the conversation is becoming such fever pitch of the disparity between who's making it and who's not. There's much more of us that are not making it, and then there's the folks that you're working with that are really, really not making it. But making those connections to be able to kind of think through what is the agenda to put the brakes on, because I think that train is moving in such a quick pace that folks are desperate for both leadership and folks with a base and a constituency that have that natural experience to be able to put truth to what's actually occurring. So I feel like there is opportunity to make those connections.
I would just say very briefly, I'm sure you remember last year the New York Times series about Dasani, the Invisible Children series. And that, for one brief moment, it really captured kind of the hearts, the minds. It riveted people all over the city, regardless of their class. I mean, it was part of conversations everywhere I went. That should hopefully show the people that you serve the power of narrative, the power of their voice. You can't tell their story nearly as effectively as they can. And when people came to my office to advocate, for other people, right, that's sort of, okay, I hear you. When people came to tell me their story, it resonated in a way that like nothing else. And so maybe one step would be to ask them to read the start of that series or one dramatic piece of that story and show them just the tremendous impact that they can have.
Last question.
Yeah, I think we should get this gentleman's question and Pam's question. And, okay, let's get the last 3 questions, and then I want to have point of privilege of Dean to pose the last discussion point.
The psychology literature tells you that as soon as you encourage somebody to think of themselves as a victim, you take away from them their ability to deal with their situation, regardless of the amount of power that's thrown against them. African American leadership in the 1960s, I would suggest, was far more effective than whatever passes for African American leadership today. Things like the Black Panthers were organizing all kinds of neighborhood programs that gave people a genuine sense of pride in themselves. The Black Muslims, most especially, Elijah Muhammad was organizing all kinds of entrepreneurial activities, especially in Chicago. When you saw the Black Muslims selling Muhammad Speaks on the streets of the city, they did it with a sense of pride that was palpable. That's all been lost today. You've read Lawrence Otis Graham's books. He talks about the African American upper class having all to do to continue themselves in existence. They don't really have the energy or the resources to worry about anybody else. And I think that we can see that happening today.
Your question, sir?
My question is, how, you talk about connecting with people on the street, but I haven't heard any of you say anything that actually does connect with people on the street. African American kids are told that they can't compete with their white counterparts. African American neighborhood organization is in collapse everywhere.
Is there a question? I just missed it.
What would you suggest to encourage that sense of pride that would create the kind of activity and the kind of movement that was occurring 40, 50, 60 years ago?
Thank you. Pam.
Ooh, there's so much I want to say. Okay, but first,
make sure there's a question, Pam.
There's a question. Dean, you could cut me off in a minute, but I just want to say thanks for bringing this. This is a good point to end on, because power and public policy. Maybe we could start with that next, even though I'll be gone. But no, seriously, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to try to make this real brief. My question is,
Can I just say this? I just think it's important, I'm sorry, that when people are foul, we say they're foul. And I can't.
Thank you, Phaedra.
I know I am not going to be invited back to the new school. And I just want to say, I totally understand why. But it's like what you just said was so foul. And the reason it is because it's so not the experience that we're having. And it's not the conversation we're having here. And we just actually talked. I mean, here's the thing. There's no defense I can give you that would be right. I just want to be clear, it's foul.
And that you're in a room with
young
other
leaders,
folks with
young
capacity.
Leaders. So go ahead, Pam.
Okay. Ooh, thank you, Phaedra. So my question is, how do we build a consensus, right? So we've been talking about power and movements and such, and I think that you touched on it, talking about the then and the now. And I think that we were more on the same page back then, and we kind of all were fighting for the same thing because we were really rising as a people then. I think that now there's so much to fight for and against that it's kind of fragmenting us. So everybody is picking an issue and fighting about it, right? So when Phaedra said, like, fall in line, right, and kind of follow your leaders and show some loyalty on the left. But I'm just wondering what that trigger would be. You said lynching back in the day, kind of collect everybody around, the same issue. I'm just trying to figure out what that issue could be today, other than the killing and slaughtering of black men in the street, that would kind of bring us all together.
Well, that's a good place to start.
No, seriously.
Let's take the last question, and then I think we have some education to give.
Hi there. I'm loud. Okay. Good evening. My name is Tiffany Drayton, and I'm a writer / blogger who covers race very heavily. I would like to pose a question specifically in the context of Black power and Black progress. With frequency, Black progressive conversation relies on an ideology kind of touted earlier by you, Mr. Bandelis, no offense. The idea that power equals organized people and organized economics. If indeed this were true, the black community would have long achieved equality in this country. In truth, the social, political, and economic progress of black people has been consistently hindered by white terrorism in the form of federal, economic, judicial practices, examples ranging from Black Wall Street, Jim Crow legislation that hindered your the progress of your ancestors, as we spoke about earlier, to today's issue of mass incarceration and housing work discrimination. So to get to my question. My question is, how precisely can we expect progress that lasts through the generations when many black leaders employ the same rhetoric and ideologies of yesteryear that fails to identify or specifically approach the fact that white America fears black progress and cyclically tries to hinder it every single time there's any hint of power redistribution?
So,
Yes, I'm sorry, that was the last question. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. So, to you, sir, with regard to judicial accountability, I'm all for it. It's a shame that all that we have is, frankly, corruption laws to go after judges. When we use them, I'm always relieved. But you're absolutely right that we need more accountability in law enforcement, and judges should not be exempted from that. With regards to you, sir, I would challenge your perspective that the black separatist movements, frankly, were the most effective examples of black leadership in our country. And that's all I really had to say about that. With regards to you, Mr. Ben is what my 9-year-old friends call me. Yeah, I know. I'm just teasing you. I'm just teasing. Way to diminish
my question by trying to make fun of it.
No, I'm not. I'm not at all. I'm trying to connect with you a bit through humor. That's all. All right. So, with regards to your question, what I would say is this. I think a lot of us were kind of raised believing, for instance, that the courts were on our side. You can look at kind of all the history we're taught as kids about Brown versus Board and all the decisions that followed after. We were not taught, as we should have been taught, that the courts are fundamentally a very conservative, big C institution in our country's history, and that was really an anomaly, and they would soon revert to the norm, and that's what we're dealing with right now. We were also, quite frankly, we saw glorifications of separatist movements, but also even of integrationists who, because they were in a court context, they would show up basically with all black folks and be a few white folks. That's really not, in the context of this democracy, a formula for sustainable change, because you're ultimately relying on the courts, who, when they do flip back, everything falls apart. And that's what we're seeing right now with voting rights and so many other things. And so the question is, okay, well, what is a sustainable strategy? And if one exists, why haven't we been able to execute it in the past? The context of my experience, most of my life, with the exception of the time I spent here in Harlem, has primarily been in the South. And in the context of the South, and those of us even who live in Harlem, oftentimes we go right back to the South ancestrally, sort of the collective wisdom is we're sort of two-time losers, right? Like, we had Reconstruction, didn't end so well. Then we had a new Reconstruction called the New South, the 70s and 80s, didn't end so well. So the question is, what is different between the period that we're entering now and those periods, and why should we still be optimistic if we've lost twice before? And I would argue that what's different are the numbers, and what is different is the possibility that those numbers represent. The majority of Reconstruction was a false majority because, frankly, when the former Confederacy was re-empowered and folks who had been traitors against their own government were allowed to vote, we lost the majority that we had held on to right away, right? In the New South, similarly, we had a lot of white Democrats who were so habitual about voting Democratic that it took basically kind of 8 years of Ronald Reagan, really 12 years of him and George H.W. Bush to get them to completely switch over to the Republican Party. So again, it was kind of a false majority because it was predicated on people sort of not voting with their team, if you will, right, the way that they saw it. So when they figured out who their team leader was, it was Ronald Reagan, right? Then they all switched parties. Again, a false majority. What's different now is that we actually have in several southern states a latent majority that through massive voter registration, and that's why you see the sudden attack on voting rights, new laws being passed for the first time in about 100 years in waves to suppress the vote. That's what they're responding to, is they've actually looked at the numbers. We haven't internalized our own power yet. But when you look at the numbers, what you'll see is that right now, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida would look very differently if we had aggressive voter registration in Black and Latino communities, and quite frankly, amongst many white students as well. And so what we should have optimism about is that we're now entering a phase where an inclusive democracy, which in the Southeast will look like more Black folks being in power, but again, practicing sort of the values that represent our community. In the Southwest, more Latinos in power, is actually within our reach. And what we have to decide is whether we're going to see ourselves as two-time losers, or we're going to see ourselves as winners and be willing to get up one more time than we've been knocked down.
I would also add one of the amazing things about being a dean is that I'm in a position to support those that are going out there in the future and those that are impacted. So I would say to you, sir, our responsibility, those of us that are older, it's not our time to question those that are being impacted. It's our time to support them.
And I'll just speak briefly to Pam, is that right? Okay, who asked, what's going to be the issue, that people organize around and really mobilize around. And I appreciate your mordant humor about what's happened over the last year and the fact that when we want to be organizing around this set of issues, we're instead forced to organize around the right of young people of color to breathe, and that's tragic. But, and we should be dealing with that because that's, pressing. But going forward, I think we have to look at what Mr. Ben was talking about with these just massive yawning disparities between poor kids and affluent kids in this country and the type of education they get. This is something that Professor Derek Hamilton has made sort of his life's work to study and has put some amazing research out on this. A guy who just won one of the most prestigious prizes in all of economics, Roland Fryer, at Harvard, is also spending his life focused on this, and they're putting forward, and I know Derek disagrees with Professor Fryer on some things, but this is really the area that I think is the next big civil right that we all have to focus on, is making smart, substantial, and strategic investments in public education, and not fighting amongst ourselves about hey, I'm against this because, I hate Teach for America because they're brand, but thinking like, what is working for poor kids of color in our inner cities so that we can bring them to where, where at least, I would love to bring them to where rich kids in this country are, but can we at least get them to where poor kids or working class kids in other industrialized democracies are? And so, I think it's going to take, frankly, some people getting over some hang-ups that they've had, some ideologies about, I'm against those people, and looking at scholarship and best practices and what is working for these kids. And there was no one formula that works for all kids. We need all types. We need some charter schools. We need community public schools that have wraparound services all day. Families have different needs. Children have different needs. And so I think it's really an all, an and as opposed to sort of an either or.
Thank you. Okay. So this is the moment that I've been dreading all semester, that this is the end of our public policy lectures. But I cannot let one opportunity go by to ask our panelists. So we're coming into a really big year. We're coming into an election year. Those of us that live and die for public policy, social justice and public policy, we're going to be active, we're going to be engaged. I would like to just know, before we wrap up, what is the one thing that you will be doing to be engaging and building the base? Because I know you're going to be out there doing it, so we want to know what you're going to be doing so that we can support you and we can work with you.
Very quickly, I'm focused right now on raising $50 million to run massive voter registration drives in 12 states, including 4 southern states.
Great. I have to follow you? Like, really? You know, I mean, for the students that have been in the class, you know that I think local is where it's at, and that, you know, I'm going to continue to kind of move the work with the best. I mean, I think the examples that folks are asking for with regards to what actually works, I can tell you what works. It's like we were able to bring on 1,200 mostly black and brown kids this summer. We're putting in almost $1 million into STEM. Like, we think very clarity around how do you get folks to jobs, to opportunity. That's our focus, and so, I mean, we'll continue to do that.
Jobs.
Jobs? Yeah.
Nothing beats a job, sister. Nothing beats a job.
Exactly. For us here at the New School and at Milano, a school that has public policy, international affairs, sustainability management, we want to bring the power of the dialogue in the election year right here on campus, so stay tuned. Yeah.
And I'm working with various groups around the issue of mass incarceration and also reentry issues with a group called Abolish the Box. We've had some successes in local areas around the country. St. Louis City, my hometown, just decided throughout St. Louis for all public sector jobs, they will no longer ask the question on any job application. And so those are the issues that I'll be focused on in the next year and a half.
Thank you. And Derek, what will you be doing?
Baby bond, wealth.
Okay. Thank you. I want to have our public policy class stand up, please. The folks that we've been learning with and engaging with. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to all our guests, and have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.